So the next thing I have to show you guys is nCloth, because people seemed interested in that. So I'm gonna save this scene since it has my janky little tree in it. I don't really care. Alright, so I'm just gonna start a new file, and if anyone wants to follow along, I'm not using any particular file, I'm just gonna be using cubes and planes. Crazy person. Alright, so first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna drop a plane in the scene. I'm going to make it bigger, and I'm going to add as many subdivisions as humanly possible. I think it's like 50, which honestly is still never enough for nCloth. And basically, the deal with nCloth, so in case you guys aren't familiar with the time slider, dear God, I'm just going to go over that like super quickly once I make Maya larger. Be giant. All right, can you guys all see the time slider stuff at the bottom of the screen? Cool. So if you've never, played with any kind of animating in Maya before, for some reason I have a tendency to go over this in all my classes, but anyway, this is the time slider. It basically just shows you which frame you're on in the scene. So like right now, it'll, whatever frame you're on, it's gonna pull up a little white number and like tell you the frame number, and also gonna gray out that particular frame, just be like, hey, this is where you are. So if you look down here, right under that time slider, there's these little boxes with numbers in them. There's 2 here and 2 over here. Basically what these are is telling you the number of frames that are in your scene and the number of frames that you're looking at right now. So the outermost boxes, so this guy here, this leftmost box and this rightmost box, are the total number of frames in your scene. So in this case, it's going from frame 1 to 200. These inner boxes here are telling you the current frame range that you were looking at within your scene. So in this case, if I set this to something like 47, it's basically saying I'm only viewing frame 47 to 120. This is good if you get an animation, you got several thousand frames in your scene. It's pretty much impossible to logically select a frame. So you'll just sort of shrink this down to whatever makes sense for you to work with. You can also, if you want to modify these inner numbers, just like drag the slider around. You can just click it and drag it. And I find that to be a lot of times easier than just entering numbers in manually, but that's basically your time slider. It'll also give you this little play button here. Pretty much standard DVD controls, honestly. Play is going to play. Oh god, that's fast. But yeah, so this is like more or less how you sort of navigate your scene and like display your objects. Or what am I saying? Run through like animations or sims or good stuff like that. I'll come back to this in like 10 seconds. I'm going to show you how to set up nCloth really quick. But yeah. So, all right. So if you want to actually set this weird little plane up to be nCloth, we need to go, if you look in the upper left, we need to go out of this modeling menu, and you're going to go into the FX menu. At this point, you should hopefully see a little tab that is just dedicated to nCloth. So if you click on that, you just do create nCloth, and then it pretty much makes nCloth. It's like honestly one of the more straightforward things in Maya is just creating nCloth. So if I come down here, and I'm going to go back to frame 1, and I'm going to press play, and you can see that my plane just sort of starts falling into the nothingness of Maya. And fun fact, in case you guys were curious, if you do Alt-B, it'll cycle through a bunch of different background colors for Maya. I personally just like the blue one, but I don't know if you care. Again, it's just Alt-B, it'll change the background. But, anywho. So again, nCloth is in the FX menu, and there's a little drop-down to make nCloth. Just select your object, and you create nCloth. You can see that once you do that, it's added a few extra things to my outliner, so it's made this nucleus. This is going to be used across any additional sim that you add into your scene. This is where you would control stuff like, if I go into my attribute editor, you can see stuff like gravity for the scene, so you can set gravity to be super high. Things are going to start falling faster. This is also where you would set stuff like wind speed, wind direction, all that good stuff. It's basically like global settings for the environment, pretty much, is what the nucleus is, if that makes sense. It's also given me this little nCloth 1, and that is pretty much tied to my plane, but there's also settings in that that are specifically for that nCloth itself. Stuff like how stretchy is it, how bendy is it, all that good stuff. I'll go over some of those a little bit later, but yeah. So again, so right now it's pretty much this plane just like falling into space, really boring. So really quick, I'm just going to throw a new material on this just to make it easier to differentiate this from the ground plane I'm about to add in. Oh god, I can't bring myself to leave that hot pink. Alright, so I'm just going to throw this in and be like, boom, here's a ground plane. And you will notice that if again, I'm going back to frame 1, and I'm going to hit play, and it falls straight through my ground. Basically, you need to tell Maya that specific objects are going to interact with your sim. So in this case, I'm just going to select that little ground plane, go back to my nCloth menu up here, and I'm just going to select Create Passive Collider. A passive collider is pretty much any object that's going to interact with your nCloth. It's not like a simmed object, it's just a thing sitting there in your scene that the cloth is going to interact with. So you can see once I've done that, it's put in this little nRigid. That's just how Maya defines passive colliders. So I'm going to play this now, and my nCloth, it actually stops when it hits the ground. It doesn't look particularly fun and clothy at this point, but it is at least not falling into the abyss. So easiest way to make this do something interesting is to just drag this thing up like this, and I'm going to play it. And it actually kind of looks fun and clothy now. And it's going to fall off my ground plane into the abyss. Delightful. But it's cloth now. And you can see that like now it's actually, since it's falling in a different place, it's actually getting like interesting ripples in that cloth. But yeah, so that's like honestly the basics of setting up nCloth. It's strangely one of the more straightforward things in Maya. And again, you get that really nice sort of like wrinkling texture there. So I guess there's a few different things you can do with Maya. Before I get into that, does anyone have any questions about anything so far? All right. So before I continue, I'm going to just sim this really quick for like a few seconds. So the thing to be aware of with sims is that, and there are ways around this. I'm not going to show them to you because it's kind of like not really, probably not useful for anything you'd be doing for this particular class. But if you're running a sim, you need to start at frame 1 or whatever. So like your sim, you can also define different start frames for your sims. By default, it's frame 1. So just leave it like that. It's probably simpler for the most part. And you can't jump ahead. Like if I wanted to go to say frame 120, I can't just like click ahead and expect this cloth to just sort of snap to whatever position it would be. I do actually need to let it just sim out, just hit the play button and just wait for it to do something. You also can't go back forth, like even once this is simmed up to frame 162, I can't like go back and scrub through this animation. You're pretty much like wherever you stop it is where you stop it. So if you need to restart your sim, you pretty much need to go back to frame 1 and then again just let it play out to whatever position you're happy with. Again, there's ways around this. It's called caching if you want to look into it, C-A-C-H-E. It's basically just saving your sim. But again, probably for this class you won't need to do that. It also makes your file, like your project files, enormous. And when I say enormous, I mean like I had a relatively chill like basic homework assignment for my sim class was like 20 gigs because of caching. It was horrifying. Anyway, so again, for this class, just go back to frame 1 if you want to restart and just let it play through. That's like actually important. I love the way this falls. Alright, so again, that's basically just like how you set up basic nCloth. If I wanted to say drop this on, actually before I do that, it is when I say good practice, I mean very good practice. I'm just gonna expand this really quick, because I'm pretty much done with the time slider, but it is very, very good practice, if not necessary almost, to not start your cloth out like this. Like don't have it clipping through a passive collider or like other thing that it needs to interact with. In this case, in the last like 2 days I've demoed this, it seems to just sort of do a thing where it'll just nicely toss that piece of cloth up out of the ground plane. In my experience, more normal occurrence, it's going to slowly cannibalize your model, suck it into itself, rip it apart, and then crash Maya and possibly your computer. So don't let your cloth clip through itself or other objects. You'll probably have to like reset up your whole, it's a whole thing. Like, it does get a little bit worse if I'll extrude this ground plane for like 10 seconds, and like theoretically this is gonna, you can see now it's not like popping it up, and it's just sort of like sitting there and like wrinkling around and just sort of like wiggling and like not really sure like what it's doing. And again, this is just because I have this clipping through, and this is like a horrible idea. You totally shouldn't do this. Sometimes clipping happens and your sims will just explode, but give it the best chance of starting out well, and don't just start it clipping. Anywho, so that's my spiel on that. If I wanted to go back in and say like drape something over maybe like the back of a chair or something, I'll show you guys some like tablecloth things, but just for the record, so I'm just gonna make a cube, set it to be a passive collider, and I will sim my sim. And you can see that now it's just gonna sort of like fall and hang out over top of this little cloth guy here, or this little cube that I made. And you can play with some of the settings to give your cloth like different properties, which again I'll go over a little bit later. But for now, that's like the basics of creating nCloth. So practically speaking, for your guys' finals, it seems like you probably would end up doing stuff like making a tablecloth. So I'll show you guys how to do that really quick. Where am I going? All right. So I'm going to make a table. It's going to be really ugly. Great. It's a table. So strictly speaking, when you start a sim, like if I were to start playing this right now and just like let it drop, there's really no reason that it has to start so far above my object. It does make more sense to just sort of take this and like shift it down, again, not clipping through my object, but like just move it closer, because you're just sort of eating up sim time otherwise. So I'm going to set this to be a passive collider, my awkward little table, and I'm going to drop my cloth, and you can see that it's wrapping pretty nicely around the table. Which brings me a little bit into the, I guess the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, you'll see that it's just sort of like flopping around for a while. So if you guys are doing stuff like tablecloths, anything like that, it is a good idea to just sort of pretty much let your sim keep going until it's done. The other thing that it's also not a bad practice to do is, I'm gonna set a bunch of extra frames in my scene, because again, if my sim loops at like frame 200, it's gonna start over again, and then I've pretty much just lost a bunch of sim time. So I'm just gonna set this to like 400 frames, and just keep letting that play. So once it more or less stops moving, I can then at that point basically save that piece of geometry and just get rid of my sim altogether. So in this case, I'm just gonna say good enough, because y'all don't need to watch the sim for like 4 years. So there's two ways that I usually use to basically save this piece of geometry from my sim. The first and probably easiest way, in my opinion, is to just duplicate the object. Pretty much actually the standard, so like anything that I've said about deformers and how you should save the object from a deformer applies here. So I can duplicate my object. If I let that cloth keep simming, you can see that this guy's still kind of moving a bit. This duplicated one is just hanging out where it was in the position it was. The other thing that you can do if you want is take your cloth and just delete history on that. So again, it's going to go through and pretty much get rid of any kind of interesting cloth stuff that was happening. For some reason, this doesn't get rid of the cloth in your scene. Not entirely sure why, which is why I usually just duplicate the object and then just manually delete all the extra stuff. But deleting history will get rid of, it'll at least stop the object being animated. So in this case, I do kind of want this to be animated, so the other thing that I see, so any questions on that? All right. So the other thing I see, there's two things that I kind of see commonly with tablecloths that are like kind of like weird errors, or like weird things that like people do that look awkward. The first would be basically stopping the tablecloth like, right here. And you can see that like all of the bottoms are still kind of being like sucked in towards presumably the base of this table here. So it does look pretty awkward and like not really gravitationally correct. I think at one point I saw someone who like stopped their sim like right here. And I was like, well, that's a logical tablecloth right there. Honestly, like not terrible if you're looking for like a folded paper something, like around a gift or something, but like does look really weird for a tablecloth. which is why, again, I say at least let your sim keep going until it more or less stops moving, because like that would be really poofy and weird looking. So that's the first thing I see. The other thing is usually it's going to be like kind of funky edges, often caused by not quite having enough geometry. So I'm just going to go through really quick and delete my cloth on this. So I'm going to go through Heaven Help Me and subdivide this model twice. So I don't feel like going back to my mesh menu or my modeling menu, so I'm just going to press and hold the space bar, and you can see it gives me options to my basic mesh controls. So I'm just going to go to mesh and smooth, and I'm going to do that again. And you can see that now my mesh is horrendously dense. I'm going to go back and turn this into nCloth and drop it again. And you can see that at this point my computer is lagging fairly hard. The good thing, and since this isn't a passive collider, it's just going straight through it, which in this case is what I want. But you can see that even just going forward, like this is stopping. Oh god, it's so laggy. If you ever need to force quit a sim, mash the escape button with aggression. But you can see here that even just looking at this, like I can see, because of this extra resolution that I have, I can actually see like where the polygons are on that table underneath the cloth. So adding more geometry like this is going to give you a lot nicer corners on your sim. But if I let this run through for at least a little while, you're also going to notice that, like, look at all the fine sort of little wrinkly clothy bits that are happening, or like wrinkly foldy bits that are happening in these corners. Having this extra resolution in your mesh, I mean, in this case, the computer's just like, it's lagging really hard, but it is going to give you a much greater number of fine wrinkles in your mesh. So if you do need like a really detailed cloth, you do need to just kind of suck it up and add the extra geometry in. And sometimes it does kind of weird stuff where, like in this case, it's turning into pajama bottoms, and then it's just going to sort of come back up and do something. But I could let it, keep going and simming. But yeah. So again, oh god, no. Okay, so this is doing that weird thing. Oh no, that's what's happening. Oh yeah, no, that's bad. So in this case, I probably started it a little bit too close to my table, and you can see that it's just sort of like sucked itself through my table somehow. Not entirely sure how this happens. It's just a weird thing with colliders. So like theoretically, if I move this up maybe a little bit, that might help. But yeah, so cloth sims are one of those things where you kind of can't really skimp on resolution. Like if you need it, and you do just need to let your computer like sit and wait there until it's done. Which is unfortunate, but like kind of the nature of sims. There are also other programs like Marvelous Designer that nCloth way faster, because that's literally all they're designed to do. It's also fun because you can sort of take it and like pick at your cloth while it's simming and like move it around, which is fun. I'm just curious to see if this. It looks like it still might rip itself through the table. It might just be the cloth settings. Kind of curious. But yeah, so again, you can see there's like a lot better resolution here compared to this guy here. I have a feeling this is still going to break. But any questions about any of that? All right. I will say that, like, depending on the laptop you have, you might not want to sim super hardcore stuff on your laptop. I do it all the time, but it does take forever. All right, and that's still broken, so I'm going to stop that. Escape. Stop it. Quite enough of that. All right. So the other thing that I guess I want to go over, apart from the resolution, is black. So I don't really need this anymore. Just like a quick demo of, I guess, why it's important to have enough loops on the edge. So a few quarters ago I taught NM2, and a lot of people were playing with nCloth, and I love nCloth. It's like the greatest thing ever. And one thing I noticed, so a lot of people are like trying to make little tablecloths and table runners, because nCloth is like totally more efficient to do that than trying to do it by hand. So I'm just gonna be like, great. All right, so take this cloth, and make two versions of this cloth. So again, I'm just subdivide this model. I'm pressing and holding space just to get to this menu bar where I can just go to my mesh tools there. Because I'm lazy. I hate selecting things. All right. All right, so I'm going to turn this little low poly strip into nCloth and the table into a passive collider. Start back at 1, and I'm going to drop that. Drops pretty easily. And you'll notice like around the corners there's like a little bit of weird, like right here it's not quite falling straight down. It's just sort of hanging out and like doing this weird thing where it like sticks off the edge. And that is literally just because there's not quite enough geometry in this for it to actually wrap nicely around that corner. All right. So again, I'm just going to go back to frame 1 real quick, and I'm going to turn my denser mesh into nCloth and be like, mwahaha sim. For some reason, the denser ones always end up falling off the table. Like you can see it's dragging itself off. But having that extra geometry does get a much nicer fold in here to an extent. It's still kind of like dragging itself off the table, really weird, but let's watch it fall. It's like a piece of pasta. But it's kind of a weird thing. So the other thing you can do if you're so inclined is, if you know where it's going to hit the edge of the table, you can go in and just like manually add some extra edge loops in there, just like right on that corner to just sort of help, define where that edge is going to be. So in this case, I'm just going to go in and be like, extra edge loops, great. And you can really just sort of like push it like that. So that when that falls, that should theoretically make a really nice corner if it doesn't fall off the table. If you guys do ever encounter things where your cloth is just randomly falling off the table for no apparent reason, I have 2 fixes for this. Again, it's like weird pasta. I don't know why it does this. It's like perfectly central on the table. Like it shouldn't be doing that. But anyway, so if I go and I click on my little N rigid for the table, and again, it'd be great if you got if you're doing a bunch of simming and you're gonna like leave the stuff in your scene, you should totally label these. But if you go in, you'll notice there's a few settings for friction and stickiness. The other setting is thickness, and this is just how, basically how, if you guys are familiar with like colliders and bounding boxes, it's basically how much distance is there between the bounding box and like the actual surface of this. So 0 would be the cloth is going to fall perfectly onto the table, and something higher is going to be, you can see there is a little bit of that gap between the cloth and the table. So if you wanted to take that down, you would just set the thickness to something lower, and there's also a setting for thickness on the cloth itself. You can see here's another thickness thing here. So you can adjust these to get the cloth closer to the table if you need to. Honestly, I usually just leave them as a default because I end up thickening my cloth anyway, and it kind of just like doesn't matter after that. But in this case, so in my N rigid, there's friction and stickiness. So I'm going to turn friction all the way up, and I'm going to drop that and see what happens. And it's still falling off my table, but just slightly slower this time. Still like awkward pasta. So friction doesn't do it. And I'm actually curious. I forget. So apparently, yeah, you can enter numbers that are larger than those default values. So if you set friction up to like 5, hopefully that would actually stop it falling off the table. And it seems like it actually pretty much does. It's just kind of bouncing around, but it doesn't seem to be like falling off the table. So you could set friction up really high. The other option that you have is to play with stickiness. Friction honestly probably makes more sense. Stickiness is literally like if you've ever, for some reason my brain is going, there's like little sticky like gummy hand toys that you get out of like 25-cent machine dispensers that you like chuck at the wall and it sticks there. It's pretty much like that. So if you like throw the cloth at the surface, it's going to stick because it's sticky. So the downside of stickiness, and it's not a great idea to adjust slider settings while you're doing your sim, so I restarted it. So the weird thing about stickiness is like it's pretty much like your object is now basically stuck to the sides. It's pretty subtle and hard to notice, but like once this sort of wraps under and like hits the sides here, it's basically going to stick there forever. Not forever, but like if you set your stickiness up really high, it'll pretty much attach to your object, which isn't always natural or like what you want, but you can do it if you want to. And you can see that's also helping the cloth sort of stay on the table. So any questions about that? All right. This also happens to be a convenient place to demo wind since I have stickiness. So if you do want to turn on wind in your scene, again, I'm just going to set my sim back to 0. I'm going to go into my nucleus, because that's where I said there's all the global settings. And you can see, so there's wind direction. This is just direction on the X, the Y, and the Z axis. So you just punch in different numbers to change that. And then I can set wind speed up. Setting wind speed up to something other than 0 is basically turning on wind. So I play this at, oh god, I've set it to 28. You can see that it's now sort of blowing awkwardly in the wind. And because I have made my table sticky, like where this is attached to my table, it is just sort of attached to my table. So it's not a terrible way to like potentially, get a scarf caught in a tree or something like that. It does look maybe a little bit, strange that it just like permanently sticks there. But that's basically wind and how you use wind. I'm curious to see what happens if I set gravity up to something really ridiculous. Yeah. Well, that's a different effect. That's neat. It's kind of gross. Anyway.
It's like a bungee cord.
Yeah, pretty much actually. All right. But yeah. So you can theoretically, like if I turned off sticky and just set the friction up to something like 5, I would guess that would probably end up blowing this off the table, just sort of slowly. But I mean, you can see that felt a little more natural than just attaching permanently to the table. But that's basically those settings, and this is now just somewhere in the vast expanse of nowhereness. So in this case, I'm just going to, this is also a convenient time to demonstrate some of the sort of cloth settings. So I'm going to turn stickiness back on, and we go into my nCloth, and I'm going to look at, so if you ever want to just disable your nCloth temporarily, there's this little enable button up here. If I just unclick that, it's just going to turn off that particular sim. Again, good if you are happy with how it turned out, or you just don't want to edit it temporarily, because it really does make your computer lag. But anywho, so if you go in your nCloth, under this dynamic properties tab, it'll show you a bunch of different attributes for your cloth. They also have their own friction and stickiness values there if you need them. But there's a few that I use most frequently. So it's like stretch resistance, compression resistance, bend resistance, shear resistance, and rigidity. Basically, if you're reading these and whatever the name is makes sense to your brain, stretch resistance, it's going to be less stretchy. The things that you understand are the ones that I use most frequently. There's obviously other weird stuff like restitution angle and bend angle drop off and all this other stuff, but that's probably more hardcore than you guys need to get into for this particular anything you're doing here. So in this case, if I set stretch resistance to something like 115, oh, I should probably also enable my sim. Thought I clicked that. All right. All right, I'm actually going to turn off wind because that makes this really hard to see what the heck is happening. So I'm just going to go back and set into my nucleus, set wind speed back to 0, and resim my sim. So this is a pretty subtle difference. You might have noticed before where the cloth kind of fell down and stretched a little bit and then bounced back up. In this case, it doesn't really do that. What's going to be a really obvious demo, and also you probably shouldn't do this because this can kind of create runaway sims that crash your computer, but if I set stretch resistance to 0, this is a fun one. It's just gonna keep going and expanding forever and never stop, and if you keep letting this go, it's gonna probably actually break your computer. So I'm gonna stop it. But it does really weird stuff. So again, usually you don't want to set these to completely 0 because it does tend to do some very strange things like this. But yeah, so I mean again, I feel like most of these are honestly pretty self-explanatory in terms of what they do. If I set this to something like 5, it's probably gonna come down and bounce a little bit before stopping. Where you can see it really comes down, then it just kind of bungees itself back up, and it's gonna bounce a bit. So there's a bunch of different settings like that. Compression resistance is more if it gets attached to, or if something's pushing on this end of the cloth over here. If you set that up crazy high, it's probably just gonna push the cloth straight in a straight line across whatever surface it's on. And there's other stuff again rigidity. If I set that to something really high, it just sort of becomes a plank of wood. Again, just a lot of sort of weird stuff with that. But I feel like most of these are fairly self-explanatory. And then there's also settings for the individual friction and stickiness of the cloth itself. I forgot you can also set bounce of cloth, which is like a very strange thing to do. Which, I don't know. Sometimes you have to... What happens if I set this to 10? Probably nothing good. Okay, well that was anticlimactic. Anyway, a lot of times, I'm not gonna lie, for like Sims, I usually just go in and start playing with sliders and be like, what does this do? But that's pretty much like the settings and like basically how you make nCloth. So any questions on any of this stuff? Alright. Really quick before I run away from nCloth forever, I'm just gonna show you guys if you need to, you do like a bedroom, you wanna make a messy bed sheet, something like that. There's kind of like a weird, there's two silly, weird ways that I tend to do that. So again, I'm just going to make a little cloth. I'm going to set the subdivisions up to 50. So honestly, 50 subdivisions on a plane like this is not a lot for a sim, but I do want it to actually run in class. But theoretically, you should have more. What am I saying? More subdivs than that. So I'm going to bring this down here, and so again, there's two ways that I usually drop cloth. So I'm going to turn this into cloth, turn my ground into a passive collider, and the first way is just sort of, why are you doing this? What? That's questionable. Alright, not entirely sure why that's not moving. I'm going to cough, just like remake that plane. Perfect. When in doubt, just aggressively remake your planes. Why is this a thing? This always works. Okay. Well, that's stupid. That's really weird. Okay, so it was just complaining that I didn't have my cloth set up. There was not letting me move it apparently because an nCloth was applied, which is weird because it always lets me do that. So I just got rid of my nCloth and then moved it. Alright, weird things. Anyway, so I'm going to reset up that nCloth. And usually what I will do is, I did it again. That was stupid. Alright. Sorry. Alright, so I'm just going to rotate this and, again, return it into nCloth. I don't know why that suddenly stopped working. But I'm just going to drop this. What are you doing? Oh. Alright, so the issue I was having, and this is like a facepalm moment, I was on frame like 140 and I was trying to move my sim around. Because I was not on frame 1, it was like, what are you trying to do to my sim in the middle of the sim? And that's why it wasn't working. So, yeah, that was dumb. So it is important if you're going to modify like the positioning of your objects or anything like that, that you do, be it frame 1 or whatever the start of your sim is. Anywho, so in this case, I'm just going to drop this down and be like, pause. I will duplicate this, turn it into another random simulation, and just drop it from a slightly different angle. And then I'll just sort of like end up with like a bunch of different sort of like lumps of cloth that are sort of plastered randomly around my scene. So yeah, I'm just gonna go back to frame 1 and be like, drop. Ha 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 ha. And kind of pause that and be like, cool, this maybe feels like a halfway decent looking little like, fluffy gross bed sheet. And again, so that's a duplicated object. It's not really going to do anything in terms of hurting my sim. So I can, set this back to 0. So again, in pretty much 2 pretty short sims, we've gone from flat plane to this weird wrinkly thing to something that looks like a halfway decent bed sheet. But you'll notice that there is, like, obviously half of this is black because I'm just looking at the back of my mesh, which is super awkward. So to fix that, usually once I'm done with the sim or like happy with the shape of my object, I'll just go through, select the entire object, and just extrude. And this is pretty much the same thing I do to do a lot of shapes. So I'll just pull that out a little bit to whatever thickness I think looks reasonable. And bam, now I have blanket. If I smooth it, it looks like pretty halfway decent. And at that point, if it's like, sitting too far off my ground plane, I can just, shift it back down into place in whatever position kind of makes sense. So that's kind of way 1 that I usually end up tossing my bed sheets. Any questions on that? Yep.
Is there a way to low poly that for a demon? You just have to hope for the best and
hope and pray.
or like what's the lowest subdivision
There's actually, so if you're looking for a static asset, and so strictly speaking, I'm not like terribly familiar with cloth simming for games. Usually it will be, I think, a little bit lower poly than whatever the heck this thing is. You can reduce this in Maya, so if you go, I'm just gonna, I'll go back to my modeling menu. So if I go to mesh, so smooth is what I usually use to subdivide it. If you go to reduce, you can see that that's actually going to just start stripping polys out of my cloth to whatever percent. It's going to get rid of whatever percentage of the polygons you specify. And you can see that, I mean, it doesn't look quite as nice now, but you can go through and do that, and that'll definitely help reduce the polys. You can also, I would highly recommend, and I don't think they have it on these computers, and I can't download it because of restrictions or whatever. There's a free program called Mesh Mixer, which is super lovely and takes like 5 seconds to learn. But you can throw your mesh in there and do, they have a much nicer reduce feature. So if you just chuck your mesh in there and reduce it, it's going to do a lot better job. Like Maya just sort of arbitrarily hacks out polys in like no particular order. Mesh Mixer is going to go through, if you have like a lot of intricate folding in one area, it's going to leave higher polys there. And then it's going to get rid of more polys in like large flat areas like this. You can also manually paint in lower geometry in Mesh Mixer. I kind of love it. I might do like a thing on it at some point, but it would have to be like a video tutorial because I don't have it here. But again, that's what I would do for a static object. In terms of cloth simming in Engine, I'm not entirely sure because I've never had to like functionally do that before.
And then also, would it be possible that if you go ahead and you take a flat plane, put a texture on it, not a texture on, but like a color map on it, so it's like so your blanket would have a design on it,
right,
and then you would apply nCloth, it'll like still have the design on it and stuff like that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna, because I happen to have this tileable brick texture handy, like a crazy person. But if I throw that onto my texture, you can see it's now just cloth bricks. But yeah, the texture is still dependent on the UVs. Since I basically started with a plane, you can see that the UVs are still laid out very logically for a plane. So it is a good idea, especially if you're doing a blanket, to like get your UVs in order before you sim it, because at this point, it's going to be a royal nightmare to try to UV this. But yeah, so textures do work really nicely with nCloth. Any other questions? Cool. All right, so there's one more way that I sort of toss cloth around, good God. And that is basically just by, it literally is kind of more like tossing cloth around. So I'm just going to leave my cloth here, and I'm going to throw in some cubes. And I might make these cubes sort of assorted sizes. It doesn't really matter, but basically I'm going to take these and move them towards my cloth. And use that to kind of basically actually toss the cloth. So this requires like a little bit of basic keyframing, nothing super crazy intense. But basically keyframing is just saving the values, like the translate rotate values of an object at a given frame, and then basically mathematically transitioning between multiple saved values for those frames, or for those values. So if I go to frame 1, and the easiest way to set a keyframe is just to hit S on your keyboard. S is in Sally. And you can see that if I look at frame 1, it's added, well, let me actually make this taller again. So you can see. All right, so if you look at frame 1, you can see that there's this little red line here that just says, hey, there's a keyframe on frame 1. You'll also notice that for my objects, it's also put this like weird little red bar next to all the values that just says, hey, these values have a keyframe on them somewhere. So I have my value set at frame 1. I'm going to go to frame, say maybe 60, and shift all my objects around. So in this case, I'm just going to like move them in, maybe rotate them a little bit. I'm not doing anything in particular. I'm just sort of like doing something. And cool, maybe I don't hate the way this looks. Great. So at this point, I need to set another keyframe, or else as soon as I move to a different frame, it's going to snap my objects back to the position at frame 1. So I'm just going to select all my objects and hit S again. You'll notice again it's made a little red line there. Be like, hey, there's keyframes. So now if I scrub back and forth between frame 1 and 60, you can see that I have this like very weird little slidey animation happening. So if I play this, it should drop my, oh, right. I should also set these 2 passive colliders. Basically, I'm just using this as a way to shift my cloth. This might be something good where, I'm going to go back to my FX menu. This would be something good maybe if you want to have like a tucked in bed and then have someone like push the bed sheets down towards their feet, something like that. So I made these all passive colliders, and now when I play it, you can see that they're just sort of like shifting my cloth around. And apparently that one is too tiny to actually do anything to it. Yes, beautiful. So I'm just kind of using these. I should also keyframe that. So I'm just setting my keyframe so this is actually like continues to exist in the ground. So you can use this to like push cloth around in a little bit more specific directions if you need to. Or like if you need to clamp it into some odd triangular V shape like this. You could potentially make like weird capes or something like this. I don't know. I don't know exactly why you'd want to do this.
Veins.
Veins?
Well, I guess
What?
you probably use ZBrush for veins.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you can totally do it. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking is like honestly if you made like a weird shaped cloth, you could kind of like push it to one side to get curtains or something. Yeah, and then just like shove a thing. So there's like definitely applications for this. It's like for some reason.
Just a question: can you use like the nCloth to like actually animate? Can you render out the animation that goes through?
Oh yeah.
So my question is, can you delay the animation
Of the sim?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a few ways to do that. So you can change like the start frame of it. I think that's somewhere under the nCloth, I think, where you do that. It's been a while. Honestly, I usually never end up doing that, but yeah, you can totally do that. You can also keyframe the values of, like, if you set gravity to 0, your cloth will literally just float there until it needs to start. But yeah, you can keyframe like pretty much any of the values for like wind direction or bounce, stickiness, all of that to sort of systematically get whatever effect you need at a given moment. It's really fun. You can also do a lot of like, I'll show you in a minute, you can do a lot of like weird non-clothy stuff with cloth. But yeah, it's super weird. Alright, so any other questions on anything I just did here? Alright. There's just like one more like super quick stupid thing I want to go over, and that's just like how to move or edit keyframes. So if I decided that I wanted these to move in faster, maybe instead of having the frame having them finish their animation at frame 60, I want it at like frame 10 or something like that. I'm just going to shift these keyframes. So I'm going to basically mouse over the frame with the keyframe on it, press and hold Shift, click on the frame. You'll notice that it highlights it red. And at this point, I can take that frame and I'm just left mouse button clicking, dragging like you would in a normal program. I'm just going to throw that onto frame 15 and click anywhere in my time slider not on that frame. And now my animation has been switched. So you'll notice that now if I scrub through, they move much faster. And after frame 15, they pretty much are done and they just stop moving. So also notice that by doing that, they're exerting sort of a different type of pressure on that little cloth. And instead of just sort of bunching it up between the cubes, they've actually like thrown it pretty much on top of this other cube. So again, by varying the speed of these blocks and how they interact or how they move in to hit the cloth, you can achieve different folds in the cloth. It's also just fun to toss fabric around in Maya. But that's pretty much my spiel on nCloth. And yeah, that's pretty much nCloth. So I did promise that I would do a quick thing on leaves. So really quick, I'm just going to make a bunch of random planes in here. And I'm going to call these leaf-y looking things. So I have all my planes, dear God. Just go back to my mesh menu really quick. And I'm just going to mesh combine these, delete the history to get rid of all this extra crap in my outliner. Okay, weird. And just duplicate that and maybe, what is happening? Oh, it's giving me grief because I'm still not at the beginning of my sim, I think. Or my keyboard's not working. I'm honestly not sure at this point. That's very weird. I think nope, it's totally working. All right, I don't know. That was bizarre. So I'm just going to duplicate these around a little bit and just kind of like make some more leafy shapes and do another mesh combine to combine these. So again, your nCloth doesn't necessarily need to be super cloth shaped. So if I start out with something like this, this is just like a weird shape, basically a bunch of planes, and this is something that I could put leaves on, like a texture on these. But if I go back to my FX menu, turn these into nCloth, and then go into my nucleus and turn on wind somewhere. Waha. Okay, so I'll leave wind off. So by default, you can see that these little awkward scraps of fabric are just sort of like falling down randomly, and just they're all behaving independently. Like it's not treating this like one single piece of cloth. So if you did have like a giant mesh with a bunch of leaves in it, you could sort of, again, make a shape kind of like this, turn on some wind, and be like, what? All right, but you can see that like they're kind of being blown around now. I'm not sure why they started dropping so late. That was a little weird. But they're being like, again, scattered around. You can also then key like wind noise. It might be a little bit hard to see on this demo. I'm also just going to hide these. Okay, we're not. But like wind noise is going to give you a little bit of like swirling in that wind. But depending on the settings that you play with, you can get a lot of like really interesting sort of effects with that. This is a probably horrible idea, but I'm going to see what happens if I turn gravity down, see if I can make these a little floatier. Oh, that's not ridiculous at all. But yeah, so I mean, that's like usually how I need to make if I'm making a leaf effect, it's usually going to be something kind of like that, except usually I'll just do it better and not modify gravity to do that. Any questions on that? It's kind of like a weird demo. All right. The only other thing I want to show you guys, just like, because most of the sim stuff that I showed you guys is like actual cloth stuff, which does make sense. So this is like a thing that I did a while ago with nCloth. Basically just like a blanket over a heating register, which I do, and it's super nice and warm and delightful. But here's an example of a bunch of like weird other stuff that I did for my sim class for the final. Pretty much most parts of this have nCloth in it. So like all of these vegetables I turned into nCloth and like dropped them on top of each other. These beans I lumped together with nCloth. The shrimp is nCloth. I made like, it's kind of bouncy, and like the eggs are all nCloth. Dropped all this with nCloth. The onions are nCloth because I'm a spaz. But like pretty much anything on this table has been touched by nCloth. So you can do a lot of like really bizarre stuff with nCloth that you wouldn't necessarily think like, hey, this is something, like it's not just a thing that you need to stick to cloth with. Again, you can do a lot of really bizarre things with nCloth. You can also use it, I couldn't find the video I did, but there's ways to basically turn a mesh into nCloth, and then you can weight certain areas to be affected by cloth. So if you're, you can actually make like sort of imagine that you have like a character with jowls or something like that you want to be animated. You want to have like little chin jowls like flapping around. You can basically set the whole character to be nCloth, and then the jowls to just be most affected by the cloth, and everything else to more or less follow the original mesh. So that his jowls will swing around and behave like cloth, but the rest of it is going to follow like the rig or whatever else he's attached to. So nCloth is super powerful, but it's like more or less the basics, and I guess probably most things that you would actually need to use for your final. So any questions on nCloth before I move on to the other things? All right, cool.